The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the two-lane highway, stretching through rural Georgia. Jenna Foster, an experienced DEA agent, gripped the steering wheel of her black Dodge Charger as she made her way home after a long day in court. She had been the key witness in a major drug case, and now, after hours of legal proceedings, all she wanted was to get home and relax. She tapped her fingers against the wheel, eyes flicking between the road and her rearview mirror. A black and white patrol car had been trailing her for the last 5 miles. No sirens, no lights, just a slow, deliberate tail. Something felt off about it. Jenna had dealt with small-town cops before, officers with inflated egos, too much power, and not enough oversight. They liked to flex their authority, pulling over anyone unfamiliar with the area. Jenna kept her speed steady at 55 miles per hour, right at the posted limit. The unease in her stomach only grew as the patrol car stayed behind her, and she could feel it was only a matter of time before they made their move. And sure enough, the red and blue lights flickered on. Jenna exhaled slowly. Here we go. She signaled and gently eased the Charger onto the gravel shoulder, bringing it to a stop. The engine shut off, and she kept both hands on the wheel, just as her training had taught her. Stay calm, stay in control, and give them nothing. She could handle this. 2 officers approached the car. Officer Blake Jackson was tall and lean, with sunglasses hanging low on his nose, while Officer Derek Harris was stockier and in his mid-40s. Both had a cocky air about them, the kind that came from abusing their power in a place where no one was looking. Jackson tapped on the driver's side window. Jenna rolled it down slowly, keeping her face neutral. "Good evening, ma'am. License and registration," Jackson said, his voice sharp. Jenna reached into the center console, handing the documents over without a word. Jackson barely glanced at them before looking back at her. "You in a hurry, ma'am?" he asked, a hint of mockery in his tone. Jenna raised an eyebrow but kept her voice even. "Nope. What's this about?" "You didn't see that stop sign a few miles back?" Jackson asked, his voice shifting to a more condescending tone. Jenna's face remained unchanged. "There was no stop sign." Jackson's grin faded and his eyes narrowed. He exchanged a glance with Harris before turning back to Jenna. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Jenna's heart rate remained steady. She knew what was happening now. This wasn't about a simple traffic stop. They were setting her up. She kept her posture relaxed, not giving anything away. "On what grounds?" Jenna asked calmly. "We'll discuss that outside the vehicle," Jackson replied with a smug smile. Jenna unclipped her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out slowly, keeping her hands visible. Harris circled behind her, resting his hands near his duty belt. "Turn around," Harris ordered. Jenna didn't comply immediately. "Excuse me?" "Turn around. Hands behind your back," Jackson commanded. Jenna's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "You've got drugs in that car, don't you?" Jackson sneered. Jenna barely held back a laugh. "You're joking, right?" Jackson didn't smile. "I'm a federal agent," Jenna said, her voice steady. "I'm with the DEA." Before she could finish, Harris grabbed her wrist, yanking it behind her. Jenna twisted free, meeting Jackson's cold gaze. "That's assault on a federal officer," Jenna said sharply. Jackson's grin vanished. "Lady, I don't care who you say you are. We've got probable cause. You fit a description." Jenna met his gaze without flinching. They had no probable cause. This was a setup. Jackson turned toward his radio. "Dispatch, suspicious vehicle." Requesting K9, Jenna's pulse stayed steady. She could feel the situation getting worse, but she remained calm. This wasn't her first time being outnumbered, and it wouldn't be the last. Slowly, she turned around, hands behind her back. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped shut on her wrists as Harris shoved her toward the patrol car. They had no idea how badly they were about to regret this. Jenna sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, the metal bars pressing against her back as the officers continued their celebration outside. She could hear their muffled voices as they patted each other on the back, like they had just made the bust of a lifetime. To them, this wasn't just about arresting some random person. It was about flexing their power, showing they could take down someone important, someone who wasn't from their little town. Jenna's jaw clenched, but she kept her breathing even. She knew better than to make any noise, to show any emotion. As much as she hated it, this was part of the game. The question now wasn't whether she could escape, it was how she was going to make them pay for their mistake. Outside the car, the sound of the trunk being slammed shut broke through her thoughts. A low whistle followed, and Jenna's instincts flared. They were going to plant something in her car. She didn't need to see it to know what was going to happen next. Sure enough, Officer Jackson walked up to the car with a smug grin, holding a vacuum-sealed brick of what looked like meth or fentanyl. He waved it in front of Harris, who strutted over like he already knew what he'd find. "Well, well," Jackson said, holding the brick up with a flourish. "Look what we've got here. Looks like we got ourselves a trafficker." Jenna's fingers curled into fists behind her back, but she said nothing. They weren't just targeting her, they were trying to destroy her. They thought they had it all figured out. Plant the drugs, get her booked, and let the system swallow her whole. But Jenna wasn't going down like that. Not now, not ever. The officers walked around the car, talking over the evidence they had just planted, continuing their false narrative. Jenna could hear Jackson telling Harris, "You ever heard of a DEA agent running kilos through my county?" He laughed, his voice full of mockery. I guess she thought flashing a badge was going to save her. Jenna's lips barely moved as she responded, though her voice carried a quiet force. "Read the damn badge, genius." Jackson's smirk deepened, but there was something in his eyes now, something that suggested doubt. "Oh, I've read it," he said. "Real or not, it won't matter. In about 24 hours, that fancy DEA title isn't going to mean anything. We'll have you booked and plastered all over the news. No one will care who you say you are." Jenna tilted her head slightly, locking eyes with him. "Oh yeah?" she asked, her voice calm. "You think this is funny?" Jackson's grin faltered for a moment, but then he recovered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're just another criminal in this town. You won't be getting out." Jenna held her ground. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As they finished their mocking banter, Jenna's mind raced through the possibilities. She knew the game was rigged against her. She could take both of them down in seconds if she wanted to, but that wasn't the right move. Not yet. They needed to dig their own hole deeper first. As Jackson and Harris continued to gloat, Jenna kept her face unreadable, her body still, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. She had been outnumbered before, but this was different. She wasn't just some random target to be discarded. She was a federal agent, and she was about to turn the tables on them. Harris walked over to the patrol car, holding Jenna's DEA badge in his hand. He flicked it between his fingers like it was some insignificant trinket. "What's this?" he asked, almost amused by the thought of someone like Jenna being in their grasp. Jenna didn't flinch. "That's mine," she said evenly. "We'll see how long that matters," Jackson sneered, tossing the badge back into the car. But Jenna knew the truth. They had made a dangerous mistake. They thought they could bury her, but she had the system on her side. Soon enough, they would realize the full extent of what they had done. The game had only just begun. Jenna sat on the cold metal bench, the rough texture of the concrete walls pressing in around her. The air inside the holding cell was stale, thick with the smell of disinfectant and old sweat. She had been in places like this before, though never on the wrong side of the bars. Her heart didn't race, though. No, she had been through far worse in her years as a DEA agent. But this time it was different. The officers outside were confident, smug even, thinking they had gotten away with their little scheme. They had planted drugs in her car, set her up with a false charge, and locked her in this cell like she was just another criminal to be forgotten. They had no idea who they were messing with. A young man sat across the cell from her, rubbing at a fresh bruise on his cheek. He glanced over at Jenna, his eyes cautious but curious. He seemed like someone who had learned the hard way how quickly things could go wrong in a small-town jail. "You know what this is about?" he asked, his voice soft but wary. Jenna met his gaze, studying him for a moment. He couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, but his face was already marked by the harsh realities of being caught in a system that didn't care. He had the look of someone who had been wronged and was now waiting for the inevitable. Nothing more than a number in the eyes of the authorities. "Something like that," Jenna said, offering a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. The young man nodded, rubbing his cheek where a bruise was already forming. "Yeah, I thought so. They got me too," he muttered bitterly. Jenna raised an eyebrow. What for? A tail light, he said with a bitter chuckle. Pulled me over, said my tail light was out, and suddenly I had a suspicious amount of cash on me. I work at a warehouse. Been saving up for months. Funny thing is, by the time I got here, that cash was gone. Jenna's jaw tightened, and the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface started to rise. This wasn't just a case of bad cops. This was a pattern. Whitmore and Harris had been doing this for far too long, preying on people who couldn't fight back. She had been targeted because she was someone who could potentially expose them. But it wasn't just her they were doing this to. They've been framing people for years, haven't they? Jenna said, her voice low. The young man nodded again, his expression darkening. Yeah, it's the same thing every time. They pull you over, plant something on you, and take you in. No lawyer, no phone calls, no one to help. You just disappear. Jenna leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. How long have you been in here? 3 days, he muttered. No one's even asked me if I need a lawyer. My mom doesn't even know where I'm at. He exhaled sharply. They don't care. They think they can just sweep us under the rug. Jenna's pulse quickened. 3 days. That was enough time for people to fall through the cracks, for evidence to disappear, for cases to be buried. The system didn't work the way it was supposed to. It was rigged against people like him. She leaned back, her mind working through the possibilities. She had to get out of here, but she also had to make sure this didn't go unnoticed. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway outside the cell. The young man tensed, his body going rigid. Jenna stayed calm, though, knowing it could only be one thing: Whitmore and Harris. The door to the holding area creaked open, and she saw the two officers, their faces twisted with that same smug arrogance. They thought they were untouchable. Let's go, sweetheart, Jackson said, his voice dripping with mockery as he reached for her. Jenna stood up, her muscles coiling like a spring. She didn't say anything as she was led out of the cell, her mind already working. She wasn't going to let this stand. Not now, not ever. As Harris pulled her roughly down the hallway, Jenna glanced back at the young man, who gave her a hesitant nod, as though silently asking if she'd be able to fix this. She offered him a quiet smile in return. It was the only reassurance she could give, but deep down she knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been crushed by the system. They had no idea what was coming. The moment Jenna stepped out of the holding cell, the weight of the situation settled over her. The officers who had mocked her, who thought they could bury her, now had no idea what was about to happen. As Officer Jackson shoved her forward through the narrow hallway, she could feel her pulse steadying. Every muscle in her body was prepared for what came next. She was no longer just the target. They were about to become the ones under scrutiny. Outside the station, the harsh buzz of radios and the metallic clank of the holding cell doors gave way to a sense of impending change. Jackson and Harris continued their careless taunts as they led her to the back of a squad car. Jenna had been trained for moments like this, but this time, it wasn't about surviving. It was about making them pay for their crime. The car door slammed shut, and she was shoved into the back seat. Her thoughts raced as she took a slow, deep breath. Her badge was still in the glove compartment of her car, likely with Jackson now. She hadn't shown it in the midst of their attack, but they didn't know how much danger they had put themselves in by doing this. She wasn't a random person they could throw away. She had connections, a team behind her, and she would use every bit of it. Inside the patrol car, Harris and Jackson were still gloating, talking about their big bust, like they'd just caught some kingpin, unaware of what was coming. Jenna kept her gaze straight ahead, letting them continue with their false bravado. Every word they spoke, every boast, only served to further dig their hole. A few minutes passed before she finally heard the sound of heavy boots approaching. It wasn't Jackson or Harris this time. It was something far more ominous. A voice rang out from behind her. "Where the hell is my agent?" Jenna didn't have to turn around to recognize the voice. Deputy Director Raymond Holt had arrived, and the game had changed. The heavy door of the station slammed open, and a group of federal agents filed inside, their presence immediately commanding attention. Holt was no stranger to situations like this. He had dealt with corruption before, but nothing quite like this. He wasn't a man who wasted time with pleasantries. Holt stepped into the room, his expression unreadable, but Jenna could see the flicker of something sharp in his eyes as he looked past her to Jackson and Harris. His gaze turned to the two officers who had thought they could make a federal agent disappear. "Release her!" Holt's voice was steady, sharp. He wasn't asking. They knew it. Jackson froze, his smug demeanor vanishing in an instant. His hand paused on the door handle as he turned toward Holt, his arrogance faltering for the first time. "Sir, she's been arrested for—" "Don't make me repeat myself," Holt interjected, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Release her now." Behind him, a U.S. Marshal stepped forward, badge gleaming in the light. "We're here to escort Agent Foster to court," the Marshal said, his voice firm and unwavering. Jenna's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile as she watched Jackson and Harris squirm. The officers exchanged a panicked look, realizing too late that they had miscalculated. Holt had already been briefed, and they were done. "Come on," Holt said, stepping forward to unlock the back door of the patrol car. He looked at Jenna, his expression softening just a touch. "You all right?" Jenna nodded, giving him a brief smile. She could feel the weight of her wrist cuffs now being removed, the metal clicking away, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a wave of relief flood through her. They had underestimated her, and now it was time to make them pay. Before she could take another step, Holt turned to Jackson and Harris, his gaze cold. "As for you two," his voice trailed off, and the officers stiffened, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. "You're under investigation for corruption, evidence tampering, and kidnapping a federal agent." Jackson's face drained of color. His arrogance was gone, replaced by fear. Harris, too, stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the words to explain himself. "You planted evidence," Holt continued, his voice low but carrying an authority that made Jackson and Harris shrink back. "You violated her rights and now you'll answer for it." Holt turned back to Jenna. "You're free to go, Agent Foster." Jenna felt her heart settle into its usual rhythm. The moment of truth had arrived, and the corrupt officers who thought they were untouchable were about to find out how wrong they were. But this was only the first step. The investigation into Jackson and Harris wasn't over. This was just the beginning. "Take them into custody," Holt commanded the marshal. As the two officers were led away in handcuffs, Jenna turned to face Holt, her expression unreadable. She had won this round, but she knew this battle wasn't over. The road ahead was long, but with each step, she was getting closer to exposing the truth. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the smell of old wood and stale coffee hanging in the air as the judge took his seat. Jenna sat at the defendant's table, calm and composed, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Her mind, however, was sharp, focused on the task at hand. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure those who had tried to bury her faced the full consequences of their actions. Across from her, the two officers, Jackson and Harris, sat with their defense attorney, a man whose expression was a mixture of disbelief and resignation. They had underestimated Jenna. Now the truth was about to come out, and they wouldn't be able to hide behind their badges anymore. The prosecutor stood first, straightening his tie. "Your Honor," he began, "the state has charged Miss Foster with drug trafficking, possession with intent to distribute, and resisting arrest." He paused, looking directly at Jenna. "The evidence against her is clear, and we request the court to move forward with the trial." Jenna didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, letting the prosecutor's words wash over her. She had heard it all before. Accusations, lies, manipulation. But this time, she wasn't just going to sit quietly. She was about to turn the tables. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, turned to Jenna. "Miss Foster, do you have legal representation?" Jenna leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto the judge's. "I don't need an attorney, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. The room went silent at her words. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that response. "I'd like to present something to the court," Jenna continued, her calmness unnerving the room. She reached into the folder in front of her and pulled out a laminated badge. She stood and walked it over to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom was still, everyone waiting for the judge to inspect the document. The judge studied it for a moment, then his eyes widened in recognition. He turned to the prosecutor. "This is a federal badge." The prosecutor's face drained of color as he quickly glanced between Jenna and the judge. "Your Honor," he stammered, "what does this mean?" The judge set the badge down, looking at Jackson and Harris. "Miss Foster is a federal agent with the DEA," he said. The words hit like a thunderclap. The room fell silent. Jackson and Harris sat motionless, their faces draining of color. Their defense attorney sat back, visibly uncomfortable as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Jenna stood tall, her voice smooth and unwavering. "That's correct, Your Honor. I'm with the DEA, and if the prosecution wishes to continue pressing charges against a federal agent who was framed by 2 corrupt officers, I'm happy to proceed." The prosecutor's face twisted in frustration, but the judge held up his hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Do you 2 gentlemen have anything to say for yourselves?" he asked, turning to Jackson and Harris. Jackson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Harris shifted in his seat, clearly panicking. Neither officer had the courage to speak, knowing that the evidence was now irrefutable. The judge looked back at the prosecutor. "I assume you'll be dropping all charges?" he asked, his tone sharp. The prosecutor hesitated, but when he looked at the evidence in front of him, Jenna's DEA badge and the rapidly collapsing case, he had no choice but to nod. "Yes, Your Honor," he said reluctantly. "Good," the judge said, turning back to Jenna. "Agent Foster, you're free to go." Jenna stood, her shoulders straight, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she would make them pay. But before she could turn away, she faced Jackson and Harris. "Now," she said, her voice calm but loaded with meaning, "let's talk about what happens to dirty cops who frame innocent people." The courtroom held its breath as Jackson and Harris stiffened, their arrogance gone, replaced with the fear they had tried to instill in others. They were the ones in trouble now. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud. "I will not tolerate corruption in this court," he said. "These officers will face the consequences of their actions." Behind her, Jenna could hear the doors of the courtroom swing open. A U.S. Marshal stepped inside, followed by a team of agents. "We have federal arrest warrants for Officers Jackson and Harris," the Marshal said, his voice booming through the room. "Charges include conspiracy, evidence tampering, and violations of civil rights." Jackson and Harris tried to protest, but it was too late. Before they could say another word, the agents moved in, placing them in cuffs. The officers, who had once been so smug, so sure of their invincibility, were now being dragged out of the courtroom in shame. Jenna watched as they were led away, her heart beating steady in her chest. Justice had been served, but this wasn't the end. There were more corrupt officers out there, more people who thought they were untouchable, but today they had lost. The courtroom began to empty, but as Jenna walked toward the doors, she caught the eye of the young man from the holding cell. He stood in the back of the room, his hands stuffed in his pockets, watching with a mix of relief and gratitude. Jenna nodded at him, a silent promise. He gave a small, thankful smile in return before turning to leave. He would be free, just like she was. But for her, this was just one victory in a long war. As she walked out of the courthouse, Deputy Director Raymond Holt fell in step beside her. "You good?" he asked, glancing at her with a look that said he knew just how much this case had taken out of her. Jenna gave him a small smile. "Yeah, for now. Nice work today," Holt said, his usual no-nonsense demeanor softening just a bit. "You've made a big impact." Jenna looked out over the Georgia horizon, the fading orange and purple of the sunset painting the sky. She wasn't done yet. There was still work to be done, still people who thought they could abuse the system and get away with it. But now she had made it clear. No one was above the law, not even the people who wore the badge.